This video is brought to you by Surfshark VPN. Stick around to learn more about how Surfshark lets you browse the web safely and securely, plus get 4 additional months for free when you sign up using offer code SKILLUP at checkout. I really love when big publishers put out little things. What do I mean by that? I mean that big AAA publishers are increasingly focusing themselves on big AAA games that are safe, probably a sequel that takes like 5 years and 1,000 developers to make, and you better believe that there's an in-game cash shop whether it makes sense for the game or not. And to be honest, I can't blame big publishers for this, because they gotta make these sorts of games to keep the lights on. I get it, I really do. But it bums me out when these publishers don't divert at least a small portion of their resources to making passion projects and weird little games that aren't intended to sell a bajillion units. Big publishers don't necessarily need to play in this space, but they should, because this is where so much creativity and innovation can happen. It's where some ideas can bubble up that end up having some big ripple effects. Hearthstone is the perfect example of that from back in the day, a small project within Blizzard made by a handful of people that went on to become a behemoth that brought digital card games into the mainstream. It's not about sales though. You guys remember when Rockstar still made video games that didn't have GTA in the title? These guys made a fucking ping pong game and it ruled! Never forget what we lost the minute shark cards were invented. Square Enix, to their great credit, is a publisher who loves a weird little side bet, God bless them. That's how we get Power Wash Simulator, which yes, is published by Square Enix. EA has long had their Originals label, which in the past has backed winners like It Takes Two. Think about that. EA shovels out so many barely updated sports games each year, which make an absolutely unconscionable amount of money, and what do they win Game of the Year for? A weird little co-op game about torturing and murdering a toy elephant made by a very excitable man with a potty mouth. You know what I'm saying, right? It's nice when the big publishers play in the small sandpit, because it can be really surprising and fun and great. Which brings us to Kunitsu-Gami Path of the Goddess, developed and published by Capcom. This game was developed by Capcom's Division 1 development studio, the studio that works on Resident Evil games and Devil May Cry games, but they diverted resources away from those projects to make this, a small, very niche, but very beautiful and very smartly constructed action strategy game. Having played through it now, I'm just so thankful that Capcom made this, because I can't imagine that this is going to sell many units, so it feels almost fleeting in its beauty. It's almost like some executive somewhere wasn't paying attention when the funds for this got greenlit, and we got this by accident. I'm not sure how many more of these sorts of games these publishers have left in them, so I'm really glad we got this one. Kunitsu-Gami Path of the Goddess is a very focused, very lean game. At first, I honestly thought this was some sort of character action game because the early trailers did so little to showcase what this actually was. I carried that assumption into my first hands-on session with it at the Summer Games Fest in LA, and so it was more than a little surprised when I learned what Kunitsu-Gami actually is. So what is it then? Well, it's an action strategy title. I think that's the most accurate way to describe it, but in terms of a real quick and dirty shorthand, you might even go so far as to call this a tower defense game. The basic premise is that a goddess is fleeing a demonic force, but she can't go alone. You play as So, and it's your charge to clear a path for the goddess, hence the game's title. Each level begins with the goddess at one end of the level, and she needs to reach the other end. In order for her to do that, you need to collect what are essentially spirit orbs. You do this by purging corruption you'll find around the map and killing the seed enemies that will try to attack the goddess when night falls. You take these orbs back to the goddess and basically cash them in, which lets you carve a path forward for her. At this point, she'll start very slowly walking along the path you've cleared, and when you've given her enough orbs, she can reach the other end of that level and you're done. Except not quite, because each level actually has 2 maps, so you have to do this again and then you're done. So if that's how you get the goddess moving, how do you defend her at nighttime? Well, there's 2 ways. The first is you do it yourself. This is where the action component of the action strategy label comes in. So is a samurai of sorts, but So's combat style was actually inspired by something called kagura, which is an ancient Japanese form of ceremonial dance. It's one of the many subtle and thoughtful ways that Kunitsu-Gami pays homage to Japanese culture and tradition. The fighting style is simple, but very graceful and flowing. There's really only 2 buttons and some basic combos, but it always feels wonderful to control, and the simplicity of So's moveset leaves room for you to be able able to focus on the game's other core combat element, the strategy. While you're exploring the map and purging corruption, you'll also encounter cocooned villagers. Liberating them also allows you to spend your spirit orbs to assign a combat role to them, like an archer, a gunner, a melee woodcutter, a healing shaman, an aggro-generating sumo, and a handful more. There's about a dozen of these unit types, each with their own progression that improves their stats and gives them new capabilities. When you assign their role, you can then bring up the tactical menu, which will allow you to move them to a specific point on the map so they can begin defending against the hordes of seethe pouring out of the Torii gates at night. That really is the bulk of it. If it sounds simple, it absolutely is. One of the best things about Kunitsu-Gami is that it's not trying to overload you with convoluted game systems or big messy UI or finicky win conditions or whatever. It's extremely confident in the underlying appeal of its core elements. That's given Capcom so much room to use those core systems creatively rather than pour on more complexity needlessly. So what do I mean by that? Well, Kunitsu-Gami is actually a surprisingly long game. It really gives like 6 to 8 hour vibes, but this thing is actually like 15 to 20 hours long depending on how thorough you want to be whilst playing it. During that entire playthrough, Kunitsu-Gami is always surprising you with new twists that make each level feel like a subtle but meaningful evolution over the last, without adding anything that feels like it's cluttering up the experience. Early levels will only have one Torii gate from which enemies emerge, but then the next one will have 2, and then the next one 3 or more, asking you to defend multiple points at once. One level might suddenly change which Torii gate is active at nighttime, requiring you to quickly reposition your troops. Another level might be set in a poison swamp. Shout out to the Souls-like fans, you're gonna love that one. One level is set on a bunch of boats mounting a dangerous crossing across a river. Another is spent fighting a literal tree which rains down cocoons that birth seethe enemies when they blossom. These are just a few examples, and there are dozens more delivered with such perfectly calibrated pacing and such finely tuned difficulty that Kunitsu-Gami resonates with this sort of craftsmanship that you can absolutely feel. You can tell the people who put this together really knew what they were doing, they tested it thoroughly. It just feels so expert as it guides you from one challenge to the next, upping the difficulty and intensity in ways that feel novel and stimulating rather than convoluted and frustrating. The biggest thing Kunitsu-Gami does to evolve its combat formula is introduce new enemy types. In fact, there's almost always a new enemy type being added in each new level, resulting in a massive bestiary by the time those credits roll. The design of these creatures is a real standout. Each of them are inspired by yokai myth, each of them look so intricate and horrific, each of them are also beautifully animated, and they all have this distinctive gait as they shamble from the Torii gate toward their prey. I think Capcom knew just how good this visual design was here, which is why they added these EMA plaques, collectible rewards which not only tell the legend of these horrific demons, but also lets you view their models in detail. I don't often use these sorts of model viewers when they're present in games, but I found myself using it a lot here because the enemy designs were so consistently compelling that I wanted to take a closer look at so many of them. It's consistent with the entire game's approach to visuals, which is to say that this is a really pretty game. The levels are far from detailed per se, but there's something in their composition that makes them beautiful. Each of them a carefully painted Japanese landscape that captures the balance between nature and architecture. When the seethe pour through these spaces, they seem such a contrast, their malformed grotesqueness set against the uniformity of Japanese gardens, temples, and dwellings. You do get extra time to explore each of these spaces when you complete the level, because at that point, you're then able to rebuild the village with the help of the villagers that you liberated from the corruption. That sounds great, and at first it seemed like it was very much in keeping with the game's thoughtfulness and pacing, but sadly this evolved to become the only disappointing aspect of Kunitsu-Gami. The rebuilding of these villages is little more than what you might experience in a mobile game, where you click on something, issue a build order, come back a little later, and it's magically done, awarding you a small amount of currency. Each village has around 6 of these things to rebuild, generally necessitating at least 3 visits back between missions to get everything done for that village, and there are a lot of villages, like maybe 16 or 17, and as you unlock more of them, you'll eventually fall into this loop where the downtime between levels is just spent in and out of menus and loading screens, hopping from village to village so you can assign the next build project to eke out some meager amount of currency. It would be nice if this was optional, but sadly it's not. The currency is the main progression currency, and not completing all of this rebuilding work does make your playthrough significantly more difficult and less enjoyable. I do wonder if Capcom had grander ambitions for this building mechanic, because it does seem like something that should fit neatly into this, and it could have been additive. Sadly though, the opposite is true, and all of this stuff ends up detracting from an experience that otherwise feels so purposeful and lovingly crafted in each element. 大口
진노 마카미 스미케르 야마사도
On July 18th, Capcom uploaded this video to their YouTube channel. It's something called Bunraku, and it's a very old Japanese tradition of puppet theater. Capcom worked with the Ningyo Joruri Bunraku Theater to create all of this. It's an original production that is the brainchild of the game's director, Shuichi Kawata, because he just loves Bunraku. The head of the theater was resistant at first because he didn't have a concept in mind for how all of this could work, so he and Kawata worked together to co-write this production. There's a certain type of game that is far more about what it evokes rather than what it is, and I'm very partial to those sorts of games. I think of games like Gris and Sable, and mechanically these are really basic games that aren't reaching for much, but the sense of artistry on display, how thoughtful and how curated they feel, it leaves a mark on you in a way that can feel almost confusing. Like, you walk away from God of War and you're like, damn man, that game had it all, the graphics and action and writing and characters and music and you name it. You walk away from Doom 2016 and you're like, holy shit, no other shooter has ever made me feel like such a badass. But some games you walk away from and you're like, wait a second, why did I love that as much as I did? And with these sorts of games, it's not about the things you can quickly and easily point to. It's all the superfluous flourishes that adorn the edges of the experience. Like, for example, one of the rewards you get for rebuilding things in the village is a sweet, only it's not a consumable, it's just a lore entry, accessible via an offering table that is essentially a proxy for the game's main menu, and you click on this plate to see a list of sweets, and they're real sweets from Japan, mind you, and it describes what they are, and where they originated from, and if they're culturally significant, etc. And to cap it all off, there's a model viewer allowing you to see these sweets up close. You can't do anything with these sweets. They're just there to be looked at and enjoyed and appreciated. Kunitsu-Gami is full of these little superfluous flourishes adorning the edges of the experience, and they make Kunitsu-Gami feel special. This is a great video game, don't get me wrong. This is not just about vibes. You're absolutely going to be pleasantly surprised by how well this plays, how tense the action can be, how clever its scenario design is, how satisfying its strategy loop is. But these things won't be the reason that you walk away from this still thinking about it. It's going to be those other things. The fighting style based on an ancient ceremonial dance, and the incredible traditionally inspired soundtrack, and the plate of sweets that does absolutely nothing, and the puppet show on Capcom's YouTube channel that they worked with a theater company to make. Kunitsu-Gami is special, and I think if you give it a shot, you're going to love it just as much as I did. I recommend it to you. Alright, so web security can be a little daunting to wrap your head around. There's so many different tools and platforms and terminology, to the point where it's hard to feel like you're properly covered because you think like, oh, maybe I'm missing that thing or this thing or whatever. So let's just make it really simple, right? What do you want when it comes to your online security? You want something that lets you browse any corner of the internet free of geolocking limitations. You want something that keeps you protected even if you're using public Wi-Fi networks. And you want something that's going to protect your personal data no matter where you are or what you're doing. Those are the exact things that this video sponsor, Surfshark VPN, does. Firstly, it lets you browse the internet without being locked out of things based on your location. That applies to streaming services that geolock certain TV shows or movies, but it also applies to online shopping, since prices can be different from one geography to the next, so Surfshark VPN can help you get the best possible price when you're making a purchase. If you're someone that uses public Wi-Fi networks like libraries, schools, or shopping malls, then a VPN is a must, because your computer is especially vulnerable when connecting to those sorts of networks, making you a target of various hacks and scams. No matter how you're connecting or where you're browsing, Surfshark VPN encrypts your data to keep your personal information safe. If you're playing games, for example, Surfshark VPN will hide your IP address, which, depending on the game, might have been accessible, opening you up to DDoS attacks. Surfshark has a bunch of other products that go even further to enhance your security, stuff like an antivirus, an anti-malware tool, real-time reports if a company that has some of your personal data gets hacked, and even a masked email generator that lets you create dummy emails when you want to sign up to something without handing over your actual email address. Best of all of this stuff is incredibly cheap. I really recommend just clicking the link below and just seeing how inexpensive it is to properly protect yourself online. For real, if this stops just one credit card hack, it will have saved you hundreds or potentially thousands of dollars, not to mention all the time that goes into having to cancel and reorganize a hacked credit card. It's insane value given the peace of mind, and if you use offer code SKILLUP at checkout, you can actually get 4 additional months for free. That's surfshark.deals/skillup using offer code SKILLUP at checkout for an additional 4 months free. Thanks Surfshark for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.